Good morning. You're listening to Mornings with Mubaraka on 103.5 FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Mubaraka Ibrahim, and we are coming to you from the Beaver Hills section of New Haven, Connecticut. Welcome to the show where we talk about national issues from a local level through a lens of diversity. I want to welcome you today. If you're listening, then you are listening to 103.5 FM on your radio dial, or you may be tuning into our show on Facebook or Periscope or any of the other social media platforms that you can find us on. And if you miss any part of the show, then you can actually find it podcasted on both SoundClouds and iTunes. Just look up WNHHLP. I want to welcome you to the show again and also let you know that today's show is sponsored by the Greater New Haven Green Fund, promoting environmental quality, public health, and equity in our communities. Today we are talking about environmental justice, and I am happy to have Marian Engelman Lotto.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me. So we are... So first, let me tell you a little bit about Marian. She is a professor at the Yale School of Public Health, as well as the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where she supervises interdisciplinary teams of law, environmental, and public health students. She also serves as a professor at the Vermont Law School, where she launched an environmental justice program. Marian Engelman Lotto, she brings a deep experience of working with environmentally overburdened communities to Yale and to all communities. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, you are a lawyer by trade, and how would you categorize your law? Would it be environmental justice law, or what would you say your specialty is?
So I went to law school to be a civil rights lawyer. My focus was on addressing racial injustice. And from the very beginning, I actually wasn't sure I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted to do civil rights work. And for those of you out there who are never sure what you want to do, I was sort of in that boat and got a dual degree in law and in political science to really figure out where do I fit in and where can I be helpful, and also to better understand why we are the way we are. Why do we have such entrenched issues of social inequality and racial inequality? So that's what I wanted to work on from the very beginning.
And how did you start your career? Did you start straight into environmental justice, or did you start into civil rights or political law? Where did you start?
Right. So after graduating from law school and doing some graduate work, I was fortunate enough to have an internship during law school, actually, with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was sort of my dream job. They're the organization that litigated Brown versus Board of Education, and really from the very beginning has been trying to use the law to bring American society closer to justice. And so I worked with the Legal Defense Fund, and really I would have taken any job working with them. But it was in the 80s, and there really wasn't a formal movement called the environmental justice movement. I got hired there in the late 80s to work on issues at the intersection of race and poverty. So for many, many years, the Legal Defense Fund, and still today, has been fighting to address overt forms of discrimination, say people on the basis of race who won't rent a home to a person of color, or very explicit forms, formal segregation in schooling. But what was clear as well is there were implicit forms of discrimination, or structural forms of discrimination. So here in Connecticut, one of the first cases I worked on was Sheff versus O'Neill, which was about inequality in the school system where maybe it wasn't intentionally discriminatory, but as a result of residential segregation, kids of color and white kids were not going to school together in the Hartford metropolitan area. And opportunities that were provided in those schools were very, very different. Kids in Farmington or in West Hartford tended to go on to college. They tended to have very different opportunities later in life. And kids growing up in Hartford, there was a much greater dropout rate. Some kids were able to withstand some of the pressures and succeed, but it takes a lot more to succeed, and that's not fair. Every kid should have an equal right to education. So that's what we argued, and we won. At least in theory, the Connecticut Supreme Court found that there is a right to equal educational opportunities here in the state of Connecticut, and they ordered the state to do something about it. So that was an issue at the intersection of race and poverty. So I started on issues of education and access to healthcare.
And so when the environmental justice movement began to pick up steam, tell me about how that affected the legal aspect of the legal landscape and what was going on legally.
Right. So it was the late 80s and early 90s, and people all across the country came together in the first People of Color Environmental Summit in Washington, and hundreds of people came. This was a few years after the United Church of Christ published Toxic Waste and Race. And that was an eye-opening study. It's available online if anybody wants to go see it, Toxic Waste and Race, published in, I think, 1987. And what it showed was that there was a pattern of putting hazardous facilities in communities of color over and beyond economic circumstances like land value or poverty status, which many people would think, oh, it could be that landfills or incinerators are in low-income areas where land value is lower. But for many communities of color, people had felt, wait a second, why are we carrying the burden of all this pollution? And it does have something to do with race. And so it was sort of mind-blowing for many people to realize, to have that affirmed, right? To realize it's not just us, it's not just our community, but we're connected to all these other communities all across the country who are experiencing something very similar to what we were. So they came together, and at the time I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and so as a legal organization, we started to say, well, what can we do to be helpful? And there were a number of organizations across the country who had to really start rethinking, what is our role with this grassroots movement where people from Hartford or Albuquerque, New Mexico, or other locations all across the country had been fighting for so long for a healthy environment, or fighting an incinerator, or fighting a landfill, and really hadn't had the legal backup. And so we started to say, well, what role can we play? And I'll say one more thing, which is that this has been, from the very beginning, a grassroots movement. And so as a lawyer, we not only had to think about new areas of the law, so learning about environmental law or land use, but we really had to think about working as technical assistance providers for communities in a different way. And I think playing that role, thinking of yourself as someone who can navigate the legal system, that's our training, and add value to a movement has always been part of the civil rights movement. People have protested, and the legal work has been hopefully part and parcel of an overall strategy for change. But in the environmental justice movement, where having a say in the future of your life and the health of your community is so central to the movement, it really caused the lawyers involved to say, okay, so what is our role, and how do we think about that differently?
How does environmental justice affect people in the inner city? Because I think that when I think about and have conversations with people about environmental justice, people think more of it being an overarching of, oh, let's do stuff to prevent the ozone layer from, right? So it's like way up here. How do we bring it back down so the everyday person understand like how this is actually affecting them, that it's a part of environmental justice?
Right. So I think as we think about environmental law, it also affects all of us, but it developed in a context in the late 70s and 80s where people were trying to save, make sure oceans are clean, which is extremely important. We all rely on it, right? And that we have biodiversity of species. And part of what the environmental justice movement reinforced is people are important. All those things, we rely on clean water, we rely on clean air, but we have to put people and our communities at the center of it all. Environmental justice, there are actually principles of environmental justice that came out of this first People of Color National Environmental Summit. And people can find those principles of environmental justice online if you just Google principles of environmental justice. And key to the principles is self-determination, that there shouldn't be decisions, whether from the corporate sector or government, about people's lives without their meaningful participation. So on a local level, how does that translate? If there is a permit up for renewal, if there is a facility that wants to put an incinerator, a sewage treatment plant, whatever it might be, in a community, that there should be the opportunity to get involved, to make a decision about whether that's a desirable use, a desirable facility in the community, or not a desirable facility, or if it is going to be in the community, but it's going to have a smell. Are there ways to mitigate the smell? And there should be processes for people who are going to be affected, not just to have to take whatever that effect is, the smell, the interference with their life, the health effects, but be involved in the conversation about whether this is a good idea or not. And if again it is, there may be ways to mitigate. So process is really important to environmental justice, but also procedural justice is a very local issue. Where are things located? And in the state of Connecticut, as in just about every state across the country, historically and today, unwanted land uses, incinerators, sewage treatment plants, they often are in low-income communities of color. And as a result, and connected to that, children have higher rates of asthma in communities with these polluting sources. The Connecticut Department of Energy and the Environment, on its website, under its page on environmental justice, says that there's more than 600 polluting sources in the 5 metropolitan areas of Connecticut: Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Norwalk, and Waterbury. And those 5 areas have 71% of the people of color in the state. So you have a disproportionate impact of polluting sources. It's people of color and low-income people of color that are bearing the burden of our infrastructure. So at a local level, environmental justice is about having a say in our own health and the future of our communities, and it's about sharing more equally in the distribution of benefits like access to fresh air, access to open spaces, access to clean parks, access to clean water, and also a fairer distribution of the environmental burdens like pollution or facilities. And that there's absolutely no reason in the year, whatever year we're in, 2019, that pollution should be distributed in a way that exposes more children of color to unhealthy environments than any other children.
So let me play devil's advocate. So how do you convince people that what you're saying is not, hey, take some of this pollutant and pollute your kids too, because all of the inner city shouldn't just be polluted, or children of color shouldn't be polluted. You should sacrifice your health too. How do you respond to that interpretation of your argument?
Yeah, I think that's just a red herring. Nobody should be sacrificed. And of course, whoever makes that argument wouldn't want to be caught saying that people of color should be sacrificed either. So that can't be the right argument, right? But more, equally as seriously, and I am serious about that, no part of our society should be sacrificed. And far be it for a country with the kind of legacy of racism that we have to not want to address the vestiges of discrimination and our historic patterns of segregation. I mean, one problem is that those patterns of segregation, not only in the South, but also in the North, the patterns of discrimination had baked in unequal land uses. And so we really have to be much more conscious about where are we putting facilities and making sure we're not exacerbating racial inequality. But to your point, if we put polluting sources in the communities of people who have less money, have fewer resources to hire lawyers, have less political clout, those polluting sources are going to be out of sight and out of mind for many in society. And we won't have what we need as a community, and I mean community at large, as a population, as a community in this country, we need to all understand what the costs of our lifestyle are. And that way we all have an incentive to recycle, or we all have an incentive to find new technologies or greener products or whatever to clean our waters. If we put polluting facilities out of sight, for many people it will be out of mind. And that creates less incentive for all of us to make change. Some people may feel disempowered, and that creates a lack of incentive to make change, and other people will just not know that something is there. I give you an example. I have I do work in a place called Tallahassee, Alabama. It's an incredible community that was set up by people who were newly freed, who had been enslaved right after the Civil War. And these families got hundreds of acres of land. So there was Black-owned land in the community. And it's an unincorporated area right outside of town. The town is called Tallahassee. And it's a predominantly white town, but the community, it's called the Ashurst Bar Smith community, is right outside town, and it's predominantly Black. And there is the state of Alabama, the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, in its wisdom, approved of a landfill, the Stones Throw landfill, right in the middle of this historic Black-owned community. And people in the community experience all kinds of health problems that they attribute to the landfill. They said they never had them before. And when you go to the community, you can smell the landfill. It's enormous, and you can see the just huge piles of trash, and at the very least, it's interfering with quality of life. So we here at Yale are partnering with faculty and students at Tuskegee to do some health monitoring and do some environmental monitoring together with the Ashurst Bar Smith community to really see what's going on and to get documentation into the hands of the community so they can more effectively advocate. They've been amazing over decades at trying to raise their voice, but without that scientific information, sometimes people don't listen to them. And we brought a member of the faculty we brought a number of members of faculty on a tour of Tallahassee. It's only 15 minutes away from Tuskegee Institute, or Tuskegee University, but we all went together to see the community and see the landfill and have sort of a walking tour of what was going on there. And there was a member of the faculty, a white member of the faculty, who lived in Tallahassee, not 5 miles away from this landfill, that had no idea that the landfill was there. Someone who's very well intended, someone who wanted to help, who works at Tuskegee, who has a specialization relating to toxics, who could be enormously helpful. But if you put these facilities in a community that is less empowered, that has less representation, it's going to be out of sight, out of mind, and create the wrong incentives for society.
When communities are impacted in this way, it already exists. And I think about it in bringing it more home. In the state of Connecticut, New Haven, the city of New Haven has the most toxic sites. So when people build, they often have to remediate.
Right.
We have the most of any other city inside of the state. This is stuff that's existing, that's been here before the environmental justice movement. Places like Tallahassee, where it's already there. What's your recourse in getting rid of it or decreasing it once it already exists? So if someone's listening to this and saying, hey, you know what, this happened in my community, but it's here now, what can I do?
Right.
What's the recourse?
So the environmental justice movement has relied on so many different types of activities and people coming together in really positive ways to make change. And I would start with that as a lawyer, I wear my lawyer hat and I work with communities to say, how do we navigate through, say, a legislative, um, what's often feels like a labyrinth, right? A legislative system. Where are there moments of opportunity where a permit might be up for renewal, or someone wants to use that land for a new use, say development, but there's a question as to how safe do they need to make the land. Those are all opportunities for community members to get involved and to have a say in the future of their community. People use protest, they use public education, they get involved in political decisions at their local level and state level. I've been on a couple of tours with Lee Cruz, who is an activist. He wears many, many hats, yes. So I'm not gonna focus on anyone.
Anybody from New Haven will know who Lee is. We know who Lee is.
So in Fairhaven, and what is amazing about his tour is that, yes, he does focus on, here's a legacy site. This is where the women licked those brushes from the from the watches, and many died of cancer from the poison from the paint that they licked off those brushes. And here's a site that needs remediation, or here are brownfields that need remediation before being reused for some other purpose. But he also looks at the community gardens at the schools and tells the history of how these community gardens got to be integrated into the science curriculum of the schools. He shows us very proudly his butterfly. He has like a monarch butterfly station where butterflies can come through and stop there. He shows the murals on the walls that the community has painted. He shows the cleanup along the river and how effective that cleanup has been, and how the community came together. Community also came together in Fairhaven to develop a path for people who want to walk and exercise and be healthier. And it wasn't super expensive, but they got, I think, a small grant to create this pathway with markers in different places in the pathway. So it'll be a safe space because it's a marked out space where more people can walk along the pathway. These are very local steps, but they're steps to make the community more active and more healthful, and for communities to get involved. Once you get involved and realize, hey, I can change my own life. I can also, I can be powerful here. I can change the way things are happening. That's a model for social change.
And all of that you would consider as a part of environmental justice?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would consider voting part of environmental justice, to raise issues, to get involved in decision making about who's your representative, and asking questions about, well, what about that incinerator, or what about that landfill, or why do our children have asthma at such high rates here in New Haven, or what about that environmental justice law, can't we strengthen it, or can we get more people into DEEP's Department of Environmental Justice? They have 2 members of the staff, Doris Johnson and Edith Pestana. Surely they could have more members of the staff. What about that sewage through combined sewage overflow that's going into the waterways? What about so all those issues can be raised in the context of an election, and then using the vote and organizing around the vote. That's absolutely part of environmental justice.
And when we talked earlier, you were telling me that within the environmental justice movement itself, that there's kind of like really 2 kind of camps, and sometimes they cross over, and sometimes they work really separately. Can you talk a little bit about how people work on both, or work on either or, when we talk about environmental justice in terms of the big picture versus kind of like the legal side of it?
I'm trying to remember precisely what we were talking about. What I would say is people work at different stages and different levels, but hopefully they're working in coordination. So environmental justice is first and foremost community driven. So even if there are efforts at the national level, or even if there are legal efforts in the courts, those efforts should support and sustain the local effort. Even if I'm a lawyer and I have to prepare papers in court, I wouldn't expect someone to take time out from their busy schedule to go through I hope they want to read it, and I welcome any input. But that's sort of my job, right? Is to prepare the best papers and vigorously advocate in court in that forum on behalf of community members. And at the same time, whatever I'm doing, the this is true about law in general. The client is the driver. That's not unique to environmental justice, but here it's even more important because in a community that might feel that so much has been imposed on the community, all those legacy sites, and maybe even today, you might have a facility that is we might consider to be a legacy site. It's been there for 20 years, but now it's expanding. And when we say, well, why should it expand here? The answer is, well, we already, spent all this money on the facility in this community. But that's not fair, right? So we have to think together about what's the first of all, the community members need to articulate to me and to just articulate in general, what do they want? Because anything I do should be in service to what the community goals are and not the other way around. I think that's crucial. I'll give you another example and another way people can get involved. So there are members of Congress, including Representative McEachin, who are putting forward a bill on environmental justice. There are actually a number of bills, and I had the pleasure of working with EJ environmental justice groups all across the country, and Cory Booker's office on an environmental justice bill that was introduced in the Senate and the House. It's called the Environmental Justice Act of 2019. And we could talk more about it. And it does some, it could, if passed, it would do some really important things. It would allow us to go to court more easily to challenge race discrimination in the environmental justice context. It would also require government decision makers to consider the cumulative impact of pre-existing facilities if they're making a new permit decision. So looking not just at would this permit comply with the law, but rather would this permit, this facility, together with all these other facilities, these 600 facilities we just talked about in only 5 communities, would that have a negative impact on the community? So it does some really important things. But Congressman McEachin is part of another effort to really think about what would be an important contribution to move environmental justice forward, to address these forms of race discrimination and also class discrimination. White communities across the country that are very low income are also overburdened with environmental infrastructure and don't have as much access to fresh air and fresh water as well. So what do we do about issues of race and class in environmental decision making? And they have put together, based on the principles of environmental justice and based on their sense of what's needed, on a website called POPVOX, POPVOX. They've put principles of environmental justice for legislation online, and people can go up and comment. And so taking what your experience is here in New Haven or across the state and saying, well, this is important to me. People should listen to us, or there should be this kind of process, or here's what I'm experiencing. People can go online, again, it's at POPVOX, POPVOX, and put their 2 cents in. And they'll then listen to those comments and try to incorporate that in national decision making and national legislation. And if we have a better moment on the national scene at some point, perhaps we can take some of these good ideas and enact them into law, which would help everyone all across the country.
Is this bill that you help work on, is it going up for a vote?
It's not. The idea is to workshop the ideas and to educate members of Congress about how important it would be to move these issues forward. Given the state of the Senate right now, it's highly unlikely they would do anything good with the Civil Rights Act or environmental laws. And so really thinking strategically about how do we do some public education, how do we get these ideas on the radar screen so that when there is a better moment, we can pass something.
So talk to me a little bit about your efforts as a professor in educating the next generation of environmental justice lawyers and political activists. What do you see changing, and how do you hope to equip them better in making a difference?
Right. So I've had the great pleasure of working with law students, public health students, undergraduates, and students at the forestry school, which are students who are either on the science side or the policy side trying to do something about the environment. And if they're enrolled in my classes, they're trying to do something about justice. All of my classes are first and foremost about social justice, and it's in this context of doing something about the environment. And so I moved from active full-time practice, where I was just sort of teaching on the side, to working with students as my full-time job just after this president got elected. And so that was November, and we started the Environmental Justice Clinic in January. And so the first thing that changed is I think there's a real hunger among students, undergraduate, graduate, law students, to make a difference and to form a community. Working with these students has been just incredible. They're generous toward one another. They recognize that we all don't know what each other's struggles are. So even though we're coming together around environmental justice, they might recognize that someone may have someone who's undocumented in their family, and they're worried that they'll be deported. And someone else may be gay, and they may be worried they'll never be able to get married, and that the court will turn around and undo the progress that's been made on gay rights. So I found that working with students, it's just been an amazing moment. I mean, it's a terrible moment in some ways, but it's an amazing moment in the schools, because students are, I think, working together and really trying to make change in a really open and generous way, and seeking to do good. So that's, I don't know if I can use the word exciting, because the atmosphere is so challenging, but it is exciting to see a generation of students that really want to go out there and use their own careers to achieve justice. And then because of climate change and the concern about climate change, I think many of them turn to the area of the environment as the place to put their efforts, and then they realize, hey, wait a sec, it can't, as you said before, it can't just be out here where we're saving the world. Climate change is going to have an impact on low-income communities and communities of color, on small island nations. When we look at, say, heat waves or fires, let's just look at fires out in California this week. If you have a ability to go to a hotel or go to a family, it is still traumatic to be evacuated, to possibly lose your home. No question, it's traumatic for everyone. But if we look at these evacuations across, places where there are hurricanes, places where there are fires, all these things that we're seeing with climate change, for someone who might be homeless, for someone who doesn't have a way of getting out of town, for someone who, after they stay in an evacuation shelter, they may not have a home to go back to, and they don't have the resources, or maybe their home was undervalued because it was in an undervalued community, and even if they are paid for the replacement of their home, it's so little money that they won't be able to purchase another home. The effects are not falling equally on everyone. And so I think once people see these issues through the lens of equality, they are absolutely motivated to do something about the social justice issue as well. So as painful as all that is, it's also exciting to work with students who are so motivated.
You know what you said reminded me of an article that I read. Some fires that happened in California, I think maybe about 6 or 9 months ago. There was an article that said Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, they hired a private fire department to literally protect their house and their neighbors, and they were saying that the article was about it being about climate change affecting poor more than affect rich, because if you can't afford to have a private fire department
Right.
to protect your house, then you're just out of luck, and it becomes a class issue, a money issue, more than issue of things being equally distributed. Not saying that their house shouldn't have been should have been
Exactly.
burned down, but that kind of brings it to the, oh, okay, this is what it means.
Exactly. And in fact, there's a follow-up on that article, I think in today's New York Times, today or
Oh, really?
yesterday's New York Times, about people who are hiring and resorting to private firefighters.
Wow.
So instead of this idea that we put our resources into common firefighting and protect all, and it, again, like you say, it's painful that anybody's house is at risk, and not that anyone shouldn't try to save their house, but it is a reflection of the fact that not all are going to suffer equally. And we need to really think about the impacts on people who have fewer resources, and also the breakup of communities. I mean, it's one thing if you're able to rebuild, but if you've lived in a community for, for generations, and now there aren't the resources to rebuild your community, and people are saying, "Oh, just leave." New Orleans, just leave. Why would anyone live in a floodplain? Well, maybe they've lived there for generations and generations. And what happens to their church? And what happens to their church community? And what happens to the loved ones that were buried in the area? And where do they go? And how do we deal with that? So there are a lot of really challenging issues that we need to think about with climate change as well.
So, in looking towards the future, what are some of the kind of like main things that you think that people need to focus on, and what are some of the action steps that people can take right away to really work towards not just protecting themselves but also their community in the environment in which they live?
Well, I don't know that Lee Cruz can be held up as a model for anyone because he's just so active and so. I don't know that I can aspire to be as active as he is, but he is really just a model. All those things that he showed us, that he and others in Fairhaven are doing, whether it's murals, whether it's a cleanup of a community, whether it's a monarch butterfly conservancy, whether it's all those ways in which they're making their own, the pathway for walking and making the neighborhood safer and healthier. All those are steps that neighborhoods and communities can take, perhaps together with their local elected officials. I think people who have concern about the safety of their water or their air, there are increasingly low-cost air and water monitors that can be installed or used. And there are groups like the Toxics Action Center, which can be found online, that are in this region that can help communities think about how do we advocate for ourselves as a community. I'm working with some communities across the country on air monitoring, and actually the class we have, it's a clinic at the School of Public Health, works with some communities to install air monitors. So if communities are feeling that there is a source of pollution nearby, and maybe the incinerator or the landfill or whatever that facility is does its own self-reporting on site, but maybe there is no monitoring off-site in the community, but people are feeling that the air isn't clean and maybe they have asthma and they're worried about it, they could work with academic partners like at the School of Public Health to install air monitors and really do their own community-based science to investigate whether they're being exposed to these little particles in the air that get into your lungs called particulate matter, or other sources of pollution. So getting involved in community advocacy, whether it's cleanup or a bill or whatever it might be, air monitoring, getting involved in local issues. Some of us were over at the Adult Learning Center in New Haven, and the students there were having a good conversation about how environmental justice affects them. And some of them were talking about the problem, for example, of cigarette butts on the ground, and in their neighborhood there's no receptacle. That is a doable project, right? Just getting a receptacle so that kids who are lower to the ground and all of us are not exposed to the smell and the pollution from all those cigarette butts. There are we there are big projects, big problems like where the highways go in New Haven. And you're right, some of those are built in. We could still get more protective walls or trees that would serve as barriers for some of the particulate matter and pollution. And so there are still things to advocate for. Also, highways are not forever. Syracuse, New York had a highway that went right through the Black community in Syracuse. Right now, they're thinking of redoing it and moving that highway out of the community. So nothing is forever. But we can look at smaller projects like dealing with a receptacle for cigarette butts, and then ultimately bigger projects if we work together.
Thank you. This was really informative. So hopefully we have some action steps, and to know that so much is happening that is a little bit closer to home is, I think, really reassuring.
No, absolutely, at every level, local, state, and federal, and people can weigh in at Congressman McEachin's website on national legislation as well. The sky's the limit for activism.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
for
so
joining
much.
us.
Okay, my
And
pleasure.
thank you for listening. You've been listening to Mornings with Mubaraka on WNHHLP 103.5 FM. This show was sponsored by the Greater New Haven Green Fund, promoting environmental quality, public health, and equity in our communities. Until next week, I remind you to go about your week and be a voice and not an echo.
That's a great tagline.